You can use the dock panel element to position elements along one edge of the window. Left, top, right, bottom, of course. And it will then arrange the elements horizontally or vertically relative to each other and stretch the controls so that they're always against one of its outside edges. By default, elements are docked to the left, but you can control this by using the DockPanel.dock property. And you would set that on each element to control where it docks. And the default value of this is left. If you wanted to dock a button to the right, you'd set its DockPanel.dock property to right. And the DockPanel.lastChildFill property of the dock panel controls whether the last element it draws fills up the remaining space. And by default, this is set to true. So let's go see how to use the dock panel and also how to use these two properties to control how elements get docked. Let's take a look at some dock panel examples. Here's our first example. I have a dock panel with a text block and 4 buttons. And the dock panel positions elements along one edge by default, and that edge is the left. So it essentially lays out these elements horizontally from left to right. To that extent, it's doing the same thing as the stack panel would if I set its orientation to horizontal. The big difference is that button 4 has been stretched to fill out the remainder of the space. By default, the last element you add to a dock panel fills up all the remaining space. So if I make this window even wider, button 4 will always resize to fill up the available space. Now if I don't want that, I can change that behavior by setting the last child fill property of the dock panel to false. And now you can see that button 4 does not resize to fill up the available space. I can make this window wider and narrower, button 4 stays the same. So at this point we might be asking, well, why would I use a dock panel instead of a stack panel? So far they seem to be doing the same thing. Well, if you set the DockPanel.dock property of elements, then you can control which edge they're docked to. So let's take a look at our next example. And here, what I've done is I've set the DockPanel.dock property of the text block to top. Button 1 is docked to the top. Button 2 docked to the left, button 3 docked to the right, button 4 docked to the bottom. So now if I make this window wider, button 3 will always be docked to the right side edge. And if I make this window taller, the text block and button 1 stay docked to the top, button 4 stays docked to the bottom, but by default it resizes to fill the available space. I can control that again by setting last child fill equal to false. And now button 4 stays docked to the bottom, but it doesn't fill up the available space. So if I make the window taller or shorter, the text block and button 1 stay where they are, docked to the top. Button 4 will stay docked to the bottom. If I make the window wider or narrower, button 3 will always stay docked to the right. Now button 4 is docked to the bottom, but notice that it doesn't get all of the bottom. That's because the order that you add elements to a dock panel matters. The text block is the first element, it's docked to the top, so it will get all of the space on the top. Button 1 is docked to the top, so it will remain essentially docked to the bottom of text block 1. Button 2 is next, it's docked to the left, it gets all of the left edge not already taken up by the text block and button 1. Button 3 is docked to the right, so it gets the entire right edge except for the space taken up by text block 1 and button 1. And then finally button 4 is docked to the bottom, but it only gets the remaining space. If I want button 4 to take up the entire bottom, I can get that, but in order to do that I have to change its order. So now inside this dock panel, text block 1 appears first, then button 1, then button 4. And so the runtime will give button 4 all of the bottom edge. Then buttons 2 and 3 are docked to what's left of the left and right margins.